It is time to say happy birthday to my March Patreon supporters. I had my first child in March so many years ago that it's hard for me to even fathom how old he is now. It's always a special time of the year for me because of my son's birthday, and it's the month that I became a mom for the first time many, many years ago. So I want to say a very happy birthday to Zoe, Ellen, Holly, Erica, Madeline, Alexandria, Sue, Tara, Alex, Lorena, Kathleen, Emily, and to my son, Dennis. Happy birthday, everyone. I hope you have an amazing celebration. In 1981, a taekwondo instructor in Oklahoma was killed by an unknown assailant. Years later, the killer confessed, though his exact motives were still in question. But when that confessed murderer escaped from prison, taking someone with him, we were left with even more questions. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. A quick reminder that I will have the next 2 weeks off and that we will be back in April. Also, check the show notes for information on Patreon, my social media accounts, and events I have coming up. CrimeCon UK does have a promo code, CrimeLines, for 10% off your ticket, and that also lets them know that you're excited I'm coming, which helps me get invited back. So definitely, if you're going to CrimeCon UK, use my promo code, CrimeLines. So let's go ahead and get into this week's case. We are going to start with Kelly Dean Hogan. He was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and when he hit high school, he had a conflict with another kid over some poker game. After he was on the losing end of a physical fight, his mom suggested he take up martial arts, if only to learn how to defend himself. Kelly ended up really taking to it, and he continued his study while he was at Oklahoma State in Stillwater, pursuing a psychology degree. And after he graduated with that degree, he kept on in martial arts. Kelly moved back to Tulsa and took a teaching job at a taekwondo school. His passion was for the sport, the art, and the instruction. However, he was working for an owner who was a lot more passionate about the business side. While Kelly focused on what happened after his students walked in the door, the owner wanted him to care more about bringing in new students. Each one brought with them registration fees and a monthly tuition. This conflict built to the point Kelly opted to leave the school and open his own in April 1978 in Tulsa. He was so loved as a teacher that he had a bit of a head start because some of his students followed him to the new school. In 1980, Kelly got married, and he and his wife Denise bought a home in the nearby suburb of Broken Arrow, which also happens to be the same town my husband grew up in. They bought a 4-bedroom house in the hopes they would fill it with children over the next several years, but that was not going to happen. About a year into their marriage, on September 16th, 1981, 27-year-old Kelly Hogan went to his taekwondo studio for a lesson with a new student. The appointment was on the books for 8 p.m. and under the name Patty Thomas. Kelly waited around, but Patty never showed up. He left around 8:30 to make the 15-minute drive home. When he got there, he and Denise left to go pick up some takeout, grab a few groceries, and then head home for the night. They arrived around 9:30. At about 10, the doorbell rang. Kelly looked out and saw a man in a blue business suit. He answered the door while Denise stood nearby listening in, curious about what someone was doing at the house that late. The man told Kelly that his girlfriend, Patty Thomas, was supposed to call him after her introductory taekwondo lesson, but he hadn't heard from her. Kelly told him that they did have an 8 o'clock appointment, but that Patty never showed up. The man did not like this answer. And he started asking questions about why didn't she show up and where did she go? And Kelly said he didn't know. He didn't even know her. Denise could tell by Kelly's demeanor that he was on guard and his patience was running thin. And it must have occurred to Kelly that it was odd the man showed up at his home and not the studio. So he asked the man, how did he get the address? And the man said Patty had written it down. And that didn't make any sense because Kelly never would have given a potential student his home address rather than the school address. But any questions Kelly and Denise still had would not be answered because the man suddenly pulled out a gun and fired once, striking Kelly in the torso. Denise screamed and Kelly told her to run. She made it out the back door and to a neighbor's house to call 911. Kelly made it to the garage where he collapsed. The shooter took off out of the neighborhood unseen by any witnesses. While Denise waited at the neighbor's house for first responders, she had the presence of mind to get her story out as quickly as possible before she forgot any details, and her neighbor wrote down what she said. When the police arrived at the house, they found Kelly in the garage where he had collapsed. He was dead. Because Denise witnessed the whole thing, she had a description of the man, but she had no idea who he was. And we know Kelly had no idea who he was. The only name they had was Patty Thomas. So an early theory was that a woman with that name had set up a lesson and then bailed on it, not telling her jealous boyfriend where she was really going. When the man went to the studio when she didn't show up after the lesson, he found it closed. Then using a trusty old phone book, he found Kelly's address and went there looking for her. But there was still a hole in this theory. Why did this interaction escalate to a fatal shooting? That answer was with the killer, so the investigators started with what they had, the name Patty Thomas. So if you lived in the area and your name was Pat, Patty, Patricia, Patrice, etc., Thomas, you were contacted. But no one knew anything or had any plans to take any sort of martial arts class. The best investigative lead they had turned out to be a dead end. An anonymous donor came forward with a generous reward, hoping it would generate more tips, but it did not. The case grew cold until May of 1986, nearly 5 years after the murder, when the Broken Arrow detectives got a call from the Las Vegas Police Department. They had a man in Las Vegas who walked into their station completely unprompted and confessed to a murder that happened in Oklahoma. Did they have a victim named Kelly Hogan? And the man confessing to the murder was named Randolph Dial. 41-year-old Randolph Dial was a thrice-divorced father of three who was known in Oklahoma, but not as a criminal. He was a well-known artist and sculptor. He had a sculpture at Epcot in Disney World, and his oil drilling rig sculptures were on the TV show Dallas. They were sitting on J.R. Ewing's desk. But if you ask Randolph, this wasn't all he was known for. He claimed to be a federal agent, though he couldn't decide between the CIA, the FBI, or Secret Service. And sometimes he had actually been an undercover cop. But then other people would hear stories about how he was special forces during the Vietnam War, and then others heard his stories about working with the mob as a hitman. Now, none of these things were true, except possibly the hitman thing, at least in regards to the murder of Kelly Hogan, because that's what Randolph Dial was claiming happened. There was never any Patty Thomas. That was all a distraction to send the police on a wild goose chase for a woman who never existed. Randolph was at Kelly's house that night to carry out a murder for hire. And Randolph was willing to give the police the name of the person who paid him $5,000 to kill Kelly. So the police initially decided to withhold the information about Randolph being in custody from the press, because they didn't want to tip off the alleged mastermind. Instead, they followed Randolph while he was wired up to see if he could get the person to give some type of confession on tape. Unfortunately, that did not happen. As for the motive of why Kelly was killed, Randolph initially claimed the entire thing was over a drug debt. According to Randolph, a cocaine kingpin from North Tulsa told him that Kelly was selling drugs out of his taekwondo studio, and he had gone back on some type of deal they had. Randolph said he had a blind hatred of anyone who dealt in hard drugs, especially towards children. Randolph seemed to think that Kelly was dealing to some of the teens at his school, and that's why he took the contract. He wanted to take out someone who was harming children. Giving this as the motive definitely comes across to me as self-serving. Sure, he killed someone for money, but it was for the greater good. He was protecting children. It was a little chance to mitigate his crime. But even if he was being honest about what he was told, the idea that this truly was drug-related seems unlikely, if not impossible. Nothing in Kelly's life indicated drug use. He was very diligent about his health. He avoided tobacco and alcohol. He rarely would even touch caffeine. And there's no evidence of involvement in selling drugs to anyone, let alone minors. Randolph would change his story in the coming years. The first change was to say that he believed the drugs were presented as a motive to get him to take the job, but he realized it was a lie. Later, he said the person who ordered the hit was actually an older student from the school who was angry that Kelly had corrected him. Regardless of the changing motivation here, Randolph has named the person. And not just to the police, he has also given the name to an author and to a journalist. Kelly's family suspects, no matter what name Randolph was giving out, the only suspect in their book was Kelly's old boss from the studio he had left. The boss resented him not just for leaving, but for the students who followed him and for his success. So we're less than 15 minutes into this episode and we already have some questions. Who hired Kelly? What was the real motive? And then another important question. Why did Randolph walk in and confess? He wasn't on the police radar. They weren't closing in on him. He got away scot-free only to turn himself in. It could be a situation where the guilt was eating him up, but I will say a strong sense of remorse doesn't really seem part of his makeup. I read some speculation that he might have been trying to get away from some other issue. If he was messing around with the type of person who would order a hit, maybe he got in over his head elsewhere, like in Las Vegas, and he figured he was safer in prison than he was walking the streets. Author Charles Sasser, who wrote a book on Randolph Dial called At Large, thinks it was ego. Randolph Dial was an ego-driven person. He got some niche fame with his art, which he did a good job marketing to the media. He did a fundraiser for thousands of dollars for a little girl who needed a liver transplant, which was something he got plenty of press for. It seemed that Randolph was doing things that would bring him attention. Then he killed a man, and it was locally a case that got a lot of press coverage initially. Coverage Randolph wasn't named in because he wasn't caught. The case then grew cold and the media attention dried up. Randolph wanted, for lack of a better word, credit for what he had set up and carried out. And, well, he got it. After his arrest was announced, he was front page news. Who was not on the front page was whoever ordered the hit. Randolph had no evidence other than his word, and the word of an accomplice is not enough in Oklahoma courts, so no one else was charged. Randolph was willing to plead guilty pretty much immediately as long as they took the death penalty off the table, which they did in a proposed plea deal in June of 1986. But then in early July, Randolph suddenly did an about-face saying that he was innocent after all and he was taking it to trial. The state said, okay, death penalty back on the table. Randolph then sat in lockup for another month with nothing but time to think about things, and he called his public defender. He wanted to go over his options and possible outcomes. His attorney went to the jailhouse, and the specifics of what was said is protected by attorney-client privilege, but we do know the lawyer laid things out for Randolph. After this meeting, Randolph pleaded guilty on August 11th, 1986, and was sentenced to life in prison. He filed for post-conviction relief in 1988, saying he did not have competent counsel before his guilty plea, but that didn't go anywhere. Kelly's widow, Denise, filed a civil suit against Randolph for wrongful death. Though he was served, he did not show up to court and did not respond, so Denise was given a default judgment for $1.5 million. Now, this wouldn't mean much for the average prisoner who maybe makes 50 cents an hour. They would never have any money to collect. But Randolph had the ability to earn more money and accumulate wealth by selling art from behind bars. This at least stopped him from profiting off of it. And this would be a very short episode if the case ended here, but it didn't. While in prison, as Denise expected, Randolph continued to make art. His story of making art from behind the prison walls, along with his supposed recommitment to Christianity, made for a human interest story. He became an example of productivity, growth, and rehabilitation behind bars. A journalist with the Tulsa World did a feature on Randolph and his art. Randolph said that it was his belief that he would be released from prison when God decided it was time. And then, 3 years later, that same journalist who covered Randolph's prison art reported on Randolph's escape from prison, which happened, I guess, after he decided he was tired of waiting on God. To explain the escape story, we have to do a little bit of a backstory. Randolph, though in prison for murder, was a well-behaved inmate. He ended up at the Oklahoma State Reformatory in Granite, Oklahoma in 1991, and this prison has multiple levels of security. The warden there at the time, Jack Cowley, believed in helping inmates better themselves from behind bars. He had ideas that would be considered prison reform today, so you can imagine they seemed absolutely radical 30 years ago. Warden Cowley has been portrayed in different ways in the media, but one thing about him is that he really did truly believe in rehabilitation and reformation, and he has continued educational work with inmates even after his eventual retirement. Anyway, Warden Cowley got to know the inmates as well as he could, and he believed Randolph and others would benefit from an arts program. With Randolph's background, he seemed to be the best person to get it started. In the summer of 1994, the warden changed Randolph to a minimum security inmate in order to give him the freedom he needed to run this program. One of those freedoms was permission to go outside of the security gate to the home of the deputy warden, Randy Parker. Randy lived in the home with his wife and 2 daughters. Though outside the security checkpoint, this house was still on the prison property. A pottery studio was set up in the garage, and Randy's wife, Bobby, who had been an educator in a prison before, was to supervise. It wasn't unlike inmates going out on work detail, and the minimum security inmates there did lawn maintenance on houses like Randy and Bobby Parker's. So this wasn't very far outside of normal protocol for the prison itself. On Tuesday, August 30th, 1994, just a couple of months after Randolph was moved to minimum security, Randy Parker left for work. When he left, he saw 49-year-old Randolph Dial working on pottery in their garage. At 11 a.m., Randolph presented himself for the inmate head count, which happened every 2 hours. Around noon, Randy's 32-year-old wife, Bobby, said she was heading into town to go shopping, and by into town, I mean about 30 minutes away. At 1 p.m., Randolph did not show up for the scheduled head count, and it was assumed he was either at the pottery studio or doing some other work task. And then, Bobby Parker never made it back from her shopping trip, and Randolph never made it to any head check for the rest of the day. At 8 p.m., it was reported that Randolph Dial had escaped, and it looked like he took the deputy warden's wife and her minivan with him. Around the time everyone realized Randolph and Bobby were missing and likely together, Bobby called her mother who lived in northern Kansas. She was crying and told her mother to call her daughters, tell them goodnight, and let them know she would be home soon. Then she said, "I have to go, I love you, and goodbye." Bobby's daughters were 8 and 11 at the time, so they had to have been very confused on why Mommy didn't come home. But it was a relief to everyone that Bobby was still alive. There are many questions surrounding this situation, but the one asked most often, as you can imagine, is, was, and always will be, did Bobby leave willingly, or was she abducted? We're going to go through everything I found on this case and the strongest evidence in support of both sides. I won't draw any conclusions, I'll leave it up to you. After that call on the first night, Bobby made contact 2 more times. Once was on the second night when she called a friend, and then 10 days later on September 9th when she called her sister-in-law. And that was all they heard from her. All of the calls were about the same. They were under 15 seconds, and the basic message was, "I'm okay and I'll be home soon." You may wonder why Bobby didn't call her husband or her kids directly. And I thought about this for a bit because honestly, it does seem odd to me as well. If she was kidnapped and got to make a phone call, wouldn't they be the first people she would try to speak to? But then I thought about it from a different point of view, and that is Randolph's. If he had kidnapped Bobby, he was the one in control and he was the one allowing these phone calls. Obviously, he would not let her call her home. That would be the first phone the police would have a tap and a trace on. But calling 3 different people and keeping the calls very short, that would make it very difficult for the authorities to trace because they wouldn't know where she would call next. And I get that this also applies to Bobby. If she ran off willingly, she also wouldn't want her calls traced. I get that. But some have used her not calling her husband and her kids as proof she went willingly, when that is making an assumption that she was in control of who she was allowed to call. If she was kidnapped, she would not have been in control. Another thing that is brought up in the debate over what happened is a painting that was found in the Parkers' garage. It was one of several paintings Randolph had done, and this one appeared to be of Bobby. She was nude, looking over her shoulder. If you think Bobby ran off with Randolph, this painting was a sign of their intimacy. While it's unlikely they were alone long enough for her to pose for it, Randolph was bold enough to leave it in the family garage where anyone could have found it. So does that mean he wasn't worried about Bobby seeing it because she already knew it was there? Or Was it the only place he could hide it? Let's remember Randolph was a prisoner. Where else was he going to put it? It would have been more likely to be spotted if he tried to carry it across the prison yard to his cell. He could have both painted this without her consent and left it where she might find it only because it was his only option. And if that's what happened, it indicates Randolph had feelings for or an attraction to Bobby. So the working theory in the early days of the investigation was that Randolph Dial had abducted Bobby Parker and went on the run. At first, it seemed like she might be the means to an end, meaning she could drive him out of town without drawing suspicion. Maybe she was a bargaining chip. But then with the discovery of the painting, was it that Randolph did have some unrequited feelings for Bobby, and that's why he took her? A possible scenario of what happened that day. Randolph was working on his art in the Parkers' garage. While he had the chance, he made a move on Bobby, which she rejected. Afraid she would report this to the higher-ups, which would immediately move his status back to medium or maximum security, something he didn't want to face, he grabbed Bobby and took off. After the description of the minivan was put out, it was found abandoned in Wichita Falls, Texas, 2 days after Randolph's escape. Granted, to Wichita Falls is less than 2 hours, so they probably ditched it pretty early on and then were in an unknown vehicle or using ground transportation like buses. With the minivan in their possession, the police were able to search it. It didn't yield much, but they did find a piece of brown tape with 15 strands of hair on it. Unfortunately for us here at Crime Lines, we are people who like forensic evidence, they did not DNA test the hair to see if it was Bobby's. But if this was her hair in the tape, it does seem like she may have been bound or gagged with that tape. And that points to an abduction if it was her hair, which again, they didn't test it. Over the next several months, a lot of tips came in. Before going to prison, Randolph had moved between Oklahoma, Texas, and the American Southwest, and he had a lot of connections. New Mexico and Texas were the strongest leads as far as where Randolph could have gone and gotten shelter or support. But they also followed up on a promising lead from northern Arkansas and a less promising one from Canada. Randy Parker ended up hiring his own PI who said his investigation pointed to the Houston, Texas area as the most likely place Randolph would have gone. Randy was having to balance looking for his wife with keeping his daughters feeling as secure as they could in that situation. As that first Christmas approached, their 8-year-old wrote to Santa that she didn't want any presents. She just wanted her mommy back home. Eventually, Randy took a job at a prison facility closer to family for the sake of his girls. He held on to the belief that Bobby had been abducted, but that she wasn't dead. Randolph would have held on to her as a bargaining chip in the event the authorities moved in on his location. Though there were some whispers, publicly this was being reported as an abduction until October 1995. Bobby and Randolph had been gone for nearly 14 months when the TV show A Current Affair ran a segment on the case. They aired a part of an interview that made it sound like an FBI agent was saying that they believed it was possible Bobby ran off willingly. The agent said that Randolph was a manipulative person and they considered he may have exerted emotional control over her. After this interview aired, the FBI made it clear that the statement was taken out of context. The lead up to those statements was the agent saying that the FBI considered this an abduction. It was only in reference to a direct question that the FBI agent conceded that they looked into the possibility Bobby was not kidnapped. And of course they did. They had to look at every angle. But the way it was framed on the TV show left viewers with the idea that this was a current working theory of the case, which it was not. So now let's fast forward to 2001. It was more than 6 years after Bobby Parker and Randolph Dial had last been heard from. And it had been 3 years since a book had been published on this case called At Large. Charles Sasser, the author of the book, was home one day when his phone rang. It was none other than Randolph Dial, wanting to call and talk about the book. According to Charles, Randolph said he read it around a dozen times and thought it was fair and objective, even though it was not always favorable to Randolph. Randolph told Charles that they were living a happy country life. Of course, all Charles wanted to know at that point was if Bobby was included in this they, and Randolph said she was. He told Charles to hang on, and a bit later, a woman got on the line identifying herself as Bobby Parker. Charles Sasser knew Randolph Dial's psych profile better than Randolph likely knew it. And he knew Randolph was smart and manipulative, so this woman could have been anyone. So Charles asked her 3 questions that were specific enough that it was highly unlikely someone other than Bobby would have known the answers to all 3. The woman answered correctly, so he was sure this was Bobby Parker. Charles asked her how she was, and she said she was fine and happy. He told her that she should call her children so they would at least know she was alive, and she said she wondered if it was better if they thought she was dead. All told, the call lasted an hour, and most of the time was with Randolph on the line, being pretty careful not to give anything away about where they were. As soon as this call ended, Charles Sasser called the FBI, and they tried to trace the origin of the call, but they could not. The impression Charles had after he hung up the phone was that Bobby Parker was with Randolph of her own free will. She sounded to him to be genuine and not under duress. There would be no more phone calls after this, but the case got a major boost in early 2005 when America's Most Wanted ran a segment on it. A tipster called in and said they recognized Randolph Dial as a man they knew as Richard Deal. They said Richard, or rather Randolph, worked at a chicken farm near the Texas-Louisiana border about 60 miles south of Shreveport. He lived in the area with his wife, whose name was Samantha. The police tracked Randolph to a secluded trailer where a team moved in to arrest him around 6:30 in the evening on April 4th, 2005. They found him there, sautéing food for dinner. Though there was a loaded gun nearby, Randolph did not resist at all, instead basically saying he knew it would eventually happen. Bobby was not home. She was at work tending to chickens at a nearby farm. So the police surrounded that place and 3 of them approached her. She quickly identified herself as Bobby Parker. It had been years since she had said that name out loud, having been Samantha Deal for the last several years. Bobby was handcuffed, though it does not look like she was charged with anything. While Randolph went to lockup to await extradition to Oklahoma, Bobby spent the night in a hotel with a deputy sheriff keeping guard. The people living in the area who encountered Randolph and Bobby over the 5 years or so they were there found the couple odd. They were reluctant to talk to anyone, even though Bobby was at least polite. Randolph, less polite, would greet anyone who came to the property with a gun in hand, demanding to know what they wanted. Bobby was the only one working, though Randolph had briefly worked at the chicken farm as well. After he got fired, Bobby started working extra hours to make up his lost income. When people would ask her why Randolph didn't have a job, Bobby would make excuses about his health, but he seemed fine when it came to doing the things he wanted to do. Bobby would cash her paycheck at a local convenience store, and check cashing at places like this included a fee, sometimes as high as 4%. A clerk, trying to be helpful, suggested Bobby could go to the bank instead to cash it, and it would save her some money, but Bobby said she didn't want to make the drive down to the bank, even though it was only 2 miles away. With how secluded the couple lived, how they kept people at arm's length, Randolph being wary of anyone on his property, and the reluctance to use a bank, everyone pretty much assumed the two had warrants out for something, and that they were in hiding, which, as we know, they were. The night Randolph and Bobby were found, Randy Parker's boss called him at home. He told him that he was on his way over there because Bobby had been found alive in Texas. They drove the 6 hours overnight to get Bobby as quickly as they could. When Randy and Bobby saw each other for the first time in 10.5 years, it was in a hotel lobby. Randy didn't doubt for a minute that Bobby had been kidnapped and held hostage. When he was asked by Dateline if there was any doubt he would take her back, he said there was no taking back. She had been a missing person and he was bringing her home. Bobby then reunited with her daughters, who were 8 and 11 when she last saw them and were now nearly 19 and 22. So now the question everyone had been asking into the void for nearly 11 years could then be posed to both Bobby and Randolph. Was Bobby Parker a victim or a co-conspirator? And they both had the same answer. Randolph admitted that he had abducted Bobby by knife point and held her hostage for 10.5 years by threatening the safety of her family. He said the relationship was never intimate, it was never romantic, but he did believe Bobby eventually developed Stockholm Syndrome to some degree. But mostly the reason she stayed was out of fear. He told the police he was not capable of hurting her children, but Bobby didn't know that, and he used it as leverage to keep her captive. Randolph said that he would probably eventually regret what he did to Bobby, but he didn't at the time. He wouldn't trade his 10.5 years of freedom for anything in the world. Even when 7 years was tacked onto his sentence for the escape, he repeated the sentiment. It was worth it for the time he was free, and he said he would do it all over again. Bobby agreed with Randolph that he abducted her at knife point and that she stayed so he wouldn't hurt her family. But she said Randolph downplayed the violence that occurred over the years that kept her compliant. Bobby did cooperate with the authorities, and though I don't have her FBI or police statements handy, she did tell the story to Dateline, so we can go over what she said happened. Starting back before the escape even happened, she said she was never comfortable with the amount of liberties given to Randolph for his art program, a man who was an admitted murderer. In particularly, she didn't like how he was at her home when she was home alone. Experienced with working in prisons, she knew being one-on-one with an inmate wasn't normal safety protocol. So rather than allowing Randolph to work in the garage, she would usually pull things out into the yard where they were in full view of everyone who passed by. On the day of the escape, after her husband left for work, Bobby said she started to feel woozy. She believed in hindsight that Randolph had somehow managed to drug her. She said before she knew what was happening, Randolph was in her home grabbing her. She said she was in this woozy, daze-like condition to the point she didn't really remember anything until they were in Texas over an hour later. She was driving, and she can't really explain how she drove in that state, but she remembered Randolph sitting on the floor of the minivan holding a knife. She also remembered having blood on her arm and her leg. Not a lot about the early movements after the escape are clear, which some will say is because she's lying, but others will say that this is just the short-term memory loss due to whatever Randolph had drugged her with. At some point, they stopped at a store, and this is when she was able to call her mother. They then stayed in a motel where Randolph bound Bobby by her wrists and ankles and beat her with a belt. He warned her that if she tried to get away, that beating was nothing compared to what would happen to her children. Bobby doesn't know how, but after they abandoned her minivan, Randolph had managed to get some money and a gun. They then took a bus to Houston. In the Houston area, they moved into an empty apartment where Bobby said she was held captive. Randolph drugged her, beat her, and made her completely dependent on him for food. She said he sexually assaulted her with objects. She had no idea what day it was and really didn't have a good grasp on how much time passed during that period. Within a short time, though, Bobby was so broken and so afraid of Randolph's punishments that she didn't dare defy him in any way. And as she became more compliant and less resistant, Randolph gave her more and more freedom. And within a short amount of time, Randolph became more bold himself. In 1997, he started a pottery company called Terracotta Gardens to try to earn a living. He ran ads on the radio, and unable to avoid publicity, he even did a radio interview, and he spoke at a women's luncheon at a country club. All while, according to Bobby, keeping her tied up back at home whenever he left. They eventually moved to work on a chicken farm where the owner believed Randolph was physically abusive towards Bobby. In one incident, Randolph even made a comment to her about being allowed to beat his wife if he wanted to, and the owner said he wasn't allowed to touch her on her property. She tried to extend some friendship to Bobby, maybe trying to help her. She invited her into the house to sit down and talk, but Bobby always declined, saying her husband wouldn't like it. In 2000, they moved to another property, which is where they would later be found. And about that phone call Randolph made to the author of the book in the case in 2001, Bobby remembered that call, and she confirmed it was her on the phone. She told Dateline that she was asleep, and Randolph woke her up to make her talk to someone on the phone. She was tired and told him as much, but he started to reach for his gun, which was a regular threat in her world. So she put up her hands and gave in. Before she got to the phone, Randolph warned her to stick to the questions asked and not to say too much. Though she knew Randolph wouldn't like it, Bobby said she did ask about her children. She thought Charles Sasser would offer to call them for her, but he didn't. Bobby held on to the hope that this was a crack in Randolph's perfect plan to keep her isolated. Now someone knew she was alive out there, and surely this would lead to a rescue. But it didn't. By the time they were found after the America's Most Wanted segment, Bobby had just assumed that she was never going to make it back home. So, we have the only two people involved in Randolph's escape saying that this was a kidnapping, but that still did not convince everyone. People, including some investigators, wondered why Bobby never raised the alarm, even though she moved freely to the convenience store, shopping in town, and to her job at the chicken farm. And the grocery store she frequented was across the street from the sheriff's office, so why didn't she go in there? Instead, it looked to them like she was trying to hide. People in town said that Bobby wore oversized clothes, a scarf, and a wide-brimmed straw hat when she went to the grocery store. It was to the point that people snickered about it behind her back, but in hindsight, being across from the sheriff's office, it seemed to make sense why she was trying to somewhat disguise herself. And then there was something Bobby said when she was taken into custody. She wanted Randolph to know that she was not cooperating with the police. She said it repeatedly. She said, "Tell Dial I'm not cooperating." And here we hit another spot. If you want to support that Bobby went willingly, well, here you go. Randolph was in police custody. He cannot get to her, her kids, her husband. Yet Bobby was saying she still wasn't going to turn him in for supposedly kidnapping and abusing her. But if you think she was abducted and held captive out of fear, this makes total sense that she wanted Randolph to know she wasn't going to talk. She wasn't thinking about him being locked up as a safety feature because, well, he had already escaped once, took her with him, and kept them off the grid for more than a decade. Nothing seemed outside of his reach, and that included her family. And Bobby's husband believed her from the start and saw her behaviors after she got home as further evidence she had been kidnapped. You know how they say that when people get out of prison after several years, they're so used to the highly regimented schedule that it takes them some time before they stop waiting for meals and just eat when they're hungry. Or even walking up to a door and just walking through it, because they're used to having even interior doors having to be unlocked before they can open them. According to Randy, he saw Bobby doing similar things. Anytime she got up to leave the room, she announced where she was going, as though she had to report it, even if it was just to the bathroom. She would ask Randy if she could have something like a soda rather than just going and getting it herself like most adults would. It took time before Bobby was moving through the house freely without asking permission for everything. While I know that her family believing her meant a lot, the opinion that would matter most for Bobby, legally speaking, was that of the investigators. As far as the FBI investigation went, they did not arrest or charge Bobby with anything, but they also did not charge Randolph with kidnapping or hostage-taking. Whatever they decided on the case, they didn't have enough to take either to trial, at least in the federal court. But the state of Oklahoma continued to investigate, and they believed Bobby helped Randolph escape. And a lot of this comes from the contents of the trailer that she and Randolph lived in. Investigators found various cards the two exchanged for holidays, including Valentine's Day, and they were cards that expressed love. The most damning was a note Bobby wrote in 2004, a year before they were found. Randolph had a heart attack, and he was hospitalized afterwards. Bobby not only didn't take this chance to escape, but she wrote him a love note about how they had a great ride and they needed to enjoy life and celebrate it because it's so short. And it said, quote, "God placed me in your path for a reason." The authorities also found condoms and a vibrator in the bedroom, giving little credence to Randolph's claims that there was no sexual relationship and that she was just a hostage. And if he lied about that, his credibility about what really happened between them was also called into question. Though the only two people who know for sure what happened, Randolph and Bobby, said that this was a kidnapping, the state didn't believe either of them. They believed Randolph was trying to protect Bobby, and Bobby was trying to protect herself. But in spite of this belief, they didn't move on this for 3 years to the day after they were found in Texas. On April 4th, 2008, Bobby was charged with assisting Randolph with his escape. She said that she was shocked when she was arrested because she wasn't aware the investigation was ongoing. The only thing that really changed between the early investigation after they were found and the arrest was that Randolph died in prison in June 2007 at the age of 62. He couldn't be a witness for either side, though his statements exonerating Bobby would be admissible. Facing upwards of 10 years in prison, Bobby rejected any plea deal. She said she was the victim, not the perpetrator, and she was not going to plead guilty to something she didn't do. The trial didn't start for another 3 years after her arrest in 2011. By that point, Bobby had been home for 6 years, and she and Randy were still together. The state's theory presented at trial was that Bobby didn't always have to be happy as a clam with Randolph for her to have initially gone willingly. Just because he was abusive after the escape didn't mean she didn't help him. She had the chance to leave him repeatedly over the years, but she didn't, and the state said that was because she didn't want to. The evidence was mostly witness testimony about Bobby, like a former inmate from the prison Bobby and Randy had worked at before they moved to Granite. He testified that he and Bobby had an affair, which was presented to show a pattern of inappropriate relationships. They had another inmate testify that he saw Bobby and Randolph driving off the prison grounds that day, and Bobby didn't look dazed or confused or distressed. They also had Warden Jack Cowley testify. He said that when he drove by the Parker house one day before the escape, he noticed Bobby and Randolph having coffee out on the front porch, and according to him, they looked a little too cozy. It would certainly be bold of them to act cozy out in front where any prison official could drive by. According to what Bobby said, she always insisted on being visible to others and never fully alone with Randolph. For her safety, she counted on the idea that anyone could drive by and see them together. And I also have to question if the warden had a concern in regard to this, why he didn't do anything about it sooner. Bobby's defense was that the state was attempting to build their case on speculation. After all, there were only two people who knew what really happened, and like I said before, repeatedly, they both said she was the victim. The defense had the dozens of times Randolph had been interviewed in person or through the mail or on the phone, and every single time, no matter who he was talking to, he said he had kidnapped Bobby. The defense accused the state of presenting false testimony to bolster their weak case. The two inmates who testified both had significant credibility issues that the defense jumped on. The defense also presented a psychological report on Randolph that brought into question the idea that he was ever allowed to be alone with Bobby Parker, or in a position to escape so easily. This exposed the warden, Jack Cowley, to some more criticism. 3 years before the escape, a psych report said that Randolph had an extreme talent for manipulation and specifically warned against allowing him around women in the prison lest he begin some type of scheming. Warden Jack Cowley was given access to that report. The Parkers were not. They trusted the warden not to put them in danger with this art program. According to Warden Cowley, though, he didn't put them in danger because Randolph didn't kidnap Bobby. She went willingly. He believed that so strongly over the years that he had 2 credible tips on where they were hiding out, and he opted to not pursue them or pass them on to the FBI. To Dateline, he said he didn't pass the tips on because it looked like Randolph and Bobby were living a quiet life, and Randolph was not committing any other crimes. He didn't see an issue with letting them be, which is a surprising take whether you think Bobby was kidnapped or not, because Randolph was, no matter what, an escaped murderer. Bobby Parker opted not to testify at trial, not because she didn't want to defend herself, but because she was not emotionally ready to recount what she claimed was her trauma to the world. Testimony in this trial lasted for 11 weeks with 80 witnesses and 800 pieces of evidence. The jury deliberated for 13 hours, and on September 21st, 2011, they came back with a guilty verdict. Though facing up to 10 years in prison, Bobby Parker was given just 1 year, which the judge ordered her to serve immediately, saying that she was a flight risk. Due to Oklahoma's good behavior sentence reduction law, she spent only about 6 months behind bars and was released in April 2012. This was the most expensive trial in the history of Greer County. It was so long that it depleted the county court's coffers just to pay the jury their minimal compensation. The county clerk told the Associated Press that the trial cost $66,000, all to end up with Bobby spending 6 months locked up. The DA said the dollar amount didn't matter to him because you can't put a price on justice. Bobby maintained her innocence before, during, and after her legal battle. She wanted to appeal the felony conviction even though her sentence was so short. A major issue was that, as a convicted felon, getting a job in her chosen profession of teaching would be difficult with that on her record. And according to her, she was wrongfully convicted. She was wrongfully labeled an accomplice when she was actually the victim. But she ran into an issue because apparently you can put a price on justice. To file a direct appeal, which is the appeal that goes over any errors at trial, you need a copy of the trial transcript. All of the testimony of all of those 80 witnesses, plus opening and closing statements and objections and everything else, were in that transcript. And copies of transcripts are charged per page. When Bobby tried to get the transcripts, they told her it would cost her $100,000. She tried to file as indigent, saying she couldn't afford that, but that was denied as she had too much in assets to be declared poor. If she wanted to appeal and get what she thought was justice, she would basically have to empty out every account and sell properties just to pay for the transcripts. So her appeal was basically over before it even got started. And regardless of the legal status of this case, I don't feel the question of Bobby's participation in the escape has been definitively answered. And while we turn over that question and the evidence in our minds, let's end the episode back where we started by remembering Kelly Dean Hogan, the man Randolph Dial killed. Kelly was a young husband looking to fill his home with a family. He brought joy and passion to taekwondo for many students, and he did so with the love and support of his family. Bobby said she was kept from her family for 10.5 years, but Kelly Hogan's family lost him forever. And the person who ordered his hit was never brought to justice. Kelly's case is not being actively investigated, and attempts to connect the mastermind to the murder have failed. But maybe justice is still possible. Maybe someone out there is holding the missing link. So if you know anything about the person behind the murder-for-hire plot against Kelly Dean Hogan, you can call the Broken Arrow Police at 918-259-8400. Thank you for listening. You can find Crimelines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crimelines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for. So I have a new podcast recommendation for you. It's not a new podcast, but it's one I think you're really going to enjoy. It's called Tapes from the Dark Side. It is an investigative true crime podcast that uses source audio to tell you compelling true crime stories. One of the best seasons out there, I think, is The Execution of Daniel Shaver. This is a story of a 2016 police shooting of an unarmed man. It is often described as the most disturbing police shooting ever caught on tape. It is an 8-part series that's looking not just at the depravity of the shooting, but also the ensuing corruption of the Mesa Police Department. And in their current season, they are turning to doing what I do here and do one case per episode rather than a series. And so each episode is going to be another compelling look into a true crime case. To find the show, just search for Tapes from the Dark Side in your favorite podcast app. That's Tapes, T-A-P-E-S, Tapes from the Dark Side. I'll leave a link in the show notes, but you'll know you are at the right place when you see their amazing logo, which is a black and white cassette tape with a skull. Again, Tapes from the Dark Side, wherever you get your podcasts.